Welcome to Crucible Cloudworks Live. My name is Chris, and each week we'll be interviewing professionals in their respective fields to get a behind-the-scenes look at what their day-to-day life is like and what it took to get there. It is my goal to empower you to find a role that you feel comfortable in, and maybe, by listening to our guests speak, you, too, can find your way. Initially, this podcast was to promote Salesforce and our team here at Crucible Cloudworks, but throughout the process, we've come across so many people with their unique take on this thing called work. Wherever you are right now, you're in the right place. So let's get started.
Hey, all. Yeah, welcome to the Crucible Cloudworks Live. I'm here today with Davrick Hayes. Just in the interest of full disclosure, I've worked with actually Davrick before, but it's our work relationship that's quite interesting. You see, Davrick here is one of the very few dedicated QA engineers out there.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say it's necessarily something to be thanked. Usually developers like me are quite at odds with people in your role, but...
And that's true. That is definitely true.
Well, at the same time, I mean, it's worth exploring this relationship somehow, especially considering that I don't really meet very many people like dedicated to QA. It seems kind of an odd path to get into. Maybe if you wanted to describe how you got started in that role.
Well, so how I got started is actually very interesting. There was a time in my life where I didn't really know the direction I was going with my career. I born and raised in LA, and I moved to Texas just out of the blue. In true young boy fashion, it was for a girl. And I worked retail management for a couple of years and realized that I wasn't really going anywhere with my life.
Right.
And moved back to LA.
Was that okay? I'm pretending that wasn't an interruption. This is an interruption.
No.
Effect, but you could cut that if you need to. But I don't know. What was I about to say? Yeah. Well, the thing is, I don't think necessarily apologies to all the retail managers out there who do start on the job and realize that that's and I'm sure it happens to more than one person, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of people that make a killing in retail management. They do so well for themselves, and props to them. It just wasn't for me. Right. I realized it wasn't for me. I knew I was going nowhere for myself. So I moved back to LA, and I was trying to figure out what I was doing because, no degree, dropped out of college, no degree.
Right.
And I was seeing a bunch of places like, well, you need a degree. And I was resorting to even Craigslist. And on Craigslist, I found a posting that was only a couple sentences long that said, get paid to play video games.
Right.
And that, as a gamer, got me hooked immediately. It turned out there's a whole long story behind the whole interview process, but it turns out that was a job with Square Enix as a localization QA. That was my first introduction into what QA was. I had no idea what it even was as a career until my first day on the job. And after that project, it was a 6-month project, I realized I loved QA as a career, not strictly because it was working on video games,
right?
Which, I mean, as a gamer, it's awesome. I love working on video games, but just the core of what QA was, I enjoyed it. So I kept working at it, went through different contracts, different projects, went from video games, I went to finance, I went to, software tech, travel tech, med tech, all over the place, really. And just kind of grew my career from there. It's definitely not a career that many people know about. It's very, very niche, and it's weird. It's a very niche career, but it's prevalent everywhere. Everywhere has some form of QA. Right. So it's kind of a weird dichotomy of like everywhere has it, but nobody knows what it is.
Right. And the thing is, I guess it's a pretty difficult thing to describe in some respects because you would have to explain how you went from, and by the way, I got my first job through Craigslist too, right? So, I mean, no shame in that game. I mean, it's weird if you think about it. I bet there's a lot of kids these days that don't even know what Craigslist was, right? Like they don't know like what the joys are of responding to an ad. It's like all text, no pictures, right? And it's like, yeah, am I going to escape with just my torso or not, right? So I mean, kids don't know that fun these days, right? Now they got like apps for everything. So
Craigslist built character.
It did, yes. You didn't know who you were going to end up meeting, so. Yeah, oh gosh, Craigslist. But nostalgia aside, it's kind of strange then that your path literally just took you from a kid that knows like just video games. Hey, I like playing games, all the way to like something who's like dedicated at a specific craft in the IT industry. But along the road, along that journey, you probably picked up, I know you've picked up a ton of skills, automation,
Oh yeah.
QA, everything else like that. And the thing is, without a definitive background, right? Without like nobody goes to school for QA, right?
No,
I
it
mean,
doesn't exist.
how do you get there? Like, how did you build that talent stack of, all the skills that you need to use on a basis to kind of get to, the echelons of the greater QA people, the senior QA people, let's just say.
It was in the early days, it was a lot of relying on more senior QA than myself through the early stages of projects. And at some point, it just ends up they move on to other roles or they get promoted within or they quit, whatever it is. At some point, I just found myself that I was the most senior QA on the team. And when you're the most senior QA on the team, the junior QAs look to you as kind of like, well, what do we do? And that when I would reach that point and I'd reach that transition, it really forced me to start thinking about why we had the processes that we had, why we were testing the way that we were testing, how we could improve it. And as far as learning new applications or new tools to use, there's always new things being developed. It just comes down to having an open mind and making sure you're staying on top of any news, any new developments, anything. Right now, it's AI. AI is being used in everything, and it's even impacting QA. But to your point, I mean, it's a lot of on-the-job training. Like you said, there's no degree for it. There's no schooling for it. There's plenty of you could go to Coursera or Udemy and say, well, take this QA course or that QA course. And there's even ISTQB certifications that you can get.
Right.
But none of that teaches you everything.
Right.
It's just, those are just the foundational, you have the very basics that you need to know to become a QA tester. And then very early on in whatever project, you're going to learn really quickly, okay, well, I mean, yeah, I know this foundational stuff, but applying it in a real world scenario is entirely different.
I think that's the thing that's always fascinated me about QA because, as a developer, okay, sure, there's good developers and bad developers, but they always got Code Academy or Leak Code or all those places that hey, learn to code, but there's not really a good resource out there for learn to QA, right? And in fact, a lot of the QA applications that even we've dealt with together, right, they're just so niche. A lot of times it's not something you can just Google and copy a block of code or something. Not even for something like Selenium automation, right?
No, I mean, it's really not. With Selenium, there are certain things that you can copy paste, right? Of course, because it's a very robust code heavy application. So there are things that you can copy paste. But when it comes to QA, and this is, I'll put a very simple analogy, or maybe not analogy, but example. When it comes to development, if you need to develop a login flow, it's really easy to copy and paste another login flow because they're pretty relatively the same the entire way.
Right.
But when it comes to QA, when you're testing a login flow, how you test it and how you approach testing it can be entirely different between two different flows, depending on what the requirements are for each separate company, each separate business, or what tools you have available, or do you have access to the back end? Are you fluent in SQL? There's a bunch of different things that you need to take into account. And of course, development gets, just as complicated, and there's certain things you can't copy paste in development too.
Right.
But
so the thing is then, in this case, let's say we have two login flows and, but the requirements are completely different. Do you have any optics into what drives those requirements for QA? I mean, to tell you the truth, just sitting from my chair here, it's usually more QA doesn't seem to be actively involved in the discussion of, planning or requirements gathering or anything. It's more hey, once it's done, just kick it to this guy and, he'll rubber stamp it for us and then we could keep moving with our sprint, right? But
yeah,
I don't think it's really that simple.
Yeah, all too often you see companies do exactly that. It's QA's not involved in the discussion and not involved in the planning. They're just given the finished, quote unquote, finished product to test and then sign off on. The problem is QA has such a unique understanding of what a particular feature, a particular project, a particular block of code, what it should be doing versus what it shouldn't be doing, what feels right to use and what doesn't feel right to use. And through the process of testing a million different things, I know me personally, over 10 years of testing things, I can take a look at a few different flows and a few different processes. And right off the bat, I know there's a few requirements that we should probably think about, even before development starts. But
Right.
because QA is not involved, it doesn't get handled until much later, pushes everything back. QA definitely should be involved much, much sooner. They should be involved in the planning. They should be involved in the discussion of, what's going to be developed. Obviously, they can't say how it gets developed
Right.
per se, but they should be involved in the discussion so they can say, hey, we need to watch out for this. We need to watch out for that. I think it should work like this because it feels better, or it doesn't feel right to use this way. Things of that nature.
So the thing is then, to take it to the higher level discussion, what, from your perspective, what would be the purpose of QA as far as the larger organization as a whole, right?
Well, the purpose of QA at the end of the day, at a very, very, very high level, is to ensure that whatever project you're working on, whatever application, whatever it is, whatever thing you're working on is at the highest degree of completeness, is what I would say.
Okay.
That's very often done through finding bugs and reporting bugs to get, or defects or errors or faults, whatever you want to call them, finding and reporting those so that they get fixed. But a large portion of that as well that often goes overlooked, like we were saying, is that discussion, that insight into how something should work holistically.
Right.
Because developers oftentimes, and you know this as well, a team isn't just one guy developing a thing. It's often a handful of people, and they're each developing individual parts that may or may not interact well with each other. QA helps kind of bridge that gap between everyone so that everyone's on the same page, so that we're all making sure that the product is the best that it can be and that everyone enjoys using it.
So from your experience, are there ways of dealing with stakeholders to involve QA in the early discussions in the development process to prevent these issues that might be coming up?
Well, whenever I get put on a team, I always try to be involved in any discussion call. I always ask to be invited. If I have any questions, I make sure to try to be heard, to speak up, so that, anything that I think needs to be addressed is addressed.
Right.
But at the end of the day, QA being what QA is, I don't really have much control over it. It's just doing my best to say, hey, and doing my best to communicate. There's a lot of value in having me in here. There's a lot of value in hearing what I have to say and taking into account the things that I say we need to take into account. And if they understand that and include me, that's great. Everything flows a lot easier. If they don't, that's at the point where it's like, well, it's out of my hands. I've made my case. I just got to do the best with what I got now.
Right. Yeah. No, I've had kind of similar struggles myself in that, if I say, for example, hey, like, I don't think this story is best assigned to this developer. Why don't I take it instead, because I have some more experience with that area. And sometimes you even get pushback saying like, hey, well, we're working in agile, so everybody should be treated equally. But we've had that discussion before where that really doesn't work sometimes, right? And the thing is, I guess, how would you handle those situations where you would have a disagreement with a developer, especially in a lot of these agile sprints that are being run where, people are just trying to get it over the finish line, right?
Yeah, it's important in those situations to understand that there's no ill will meant between people.
Right.
That you're both professionals, you're both just trying to get a job done. And you maybe, and oftentimes I find it's not even that you disagree on the way to get there to the finalized project or finalized whatever it is. There's maybe just a communication barrier, because everyone has different communication styles.
True.
So It's just a matter of understanding where the other party's coming from, understanding why they're saying what they're saying, and
Right.
making sure they understand you as well. You
Right.
reach a common ground that way. You can even reach compromises. If it is something like you both just disagree entirely, then it becomes a conversation of, hey, well, let's have a compromise down the middle
Right.
so that we can do the best that we can. We're both happy, we're both satisfied, and we can move on.
Is there a reason you think that a lot of times the relationship between development and QA is seen as more adversarial? Like, usually a lot of these cats are like, oh, I don't know why he's not passing it or something like that. I mean, it could be just like, why can't we just all say like, hey, I'm here to help you shine, right? So,
Yeah, and I mean it's often seen as adversarial, I think. Again, this is just my opinion, but at the end of the day, a QA's job is to break a developer's code,
yeah,
right? In a tech space at least. So, the developer puts their heart and soul into coding this thing, and they're so happy with it. And then QA takes it and crumples it up and throws it back
yeah,
at them and says
yeah,
it sucks. Fix it. Like, there's certain people that would view that as adversarial, but that's not really the full scope of what's going on. It's more of a, hey, I know that you coded this thing and it's wonderful 99% of the time, but
yeah.
here's this 1% of the time that it isn't. We need to fix that 1%. So focusing on the bad stuff as a QA, speaking to a developer, it can lead to some butting of heads, we'll say.
You're right in that. I think it's just really an attitude that you're bringing to things, and the more we think about it, like it does feel on its surface kind of immature to think like, oh, like someone didn't like my artwork or something like that, right? And everybody's got that inner 5-year-old that wants to be the only person with their artwork posted on the fridge, I guess. And you're quite proud of what you did, but at the same time, I think there's a certain maturity involved in letting someone scrutinize your things and trying to use that as an opportunity to iterate and be better, right?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier about just, understanding that you're just two professionals trying to do a job. It has nothing to do with you as a person.
Right.
It has nothing to do with how I view someone's skills as a developer or as a programmer or as an engineer or whatever it is. It's just, hey, I'm doing my job and I found these things, you know, let's
Would you
fix
say
it.
there's a certain mentality that comes to QA about it then? Like, are you like the typical Karen who's always pointing out problems with stuff? Or is it, as you said, a more holistic approach with things, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely the type of QA that I try to be,
Hmm.
um, really becomes less of a like you said, the Karen type will just point out what's wrong,
Right.
but more of the we're a team making this product the best that we can. Um, and going to a developer in a your code is great. Here's a couple things that would make it even better. And I think approaching it that way makes people feel a lot better.
Yeah. I guess so. I think it really comes down to, and I'm only speaking from the development standpoint, that like if you ask a lot of developers, hey, have you ever written any bad code? I guarantee you, probably a majority of them would say, no, never. I always do my best. I always produce great stuff. Like, I mean, for me, I'm more than happy to admit there's times when I've been a little under the gun. I might have like, kind of put a few things under the rug or something like that, right? So, it never
Yeah.
got past you, but still, right?
Pride myself on that part.
Yeah,
there
yeah.
were there were a couple
Yeah, I
times
mean, yeah,
where
come on, Davrick. You should have just rubber stamped my stuff and let it through, right? Come on.
yeah, there were a couple times where I kept throwing stuff back at you. I think it was like every single deploy, and it pushed stuff back
Yeah,
like almost a week
yeah.
because I just kept pushing stuff back.
But I mean, it's ready to go when it's ready to go, and that's
Yep.
something I think a lot of people can understand. And I mean, this has definitely applications outside of the world of technology. I mean, look at all the product recalls out there, right? I mean,
Oh
clearly
yeah.
some
Oh
people
yeah.
out there are still trying to like put half an effort into there. So
Oh yeah. They'll try to put QA responsibilities on developers or on engineers or PMs or BAs, what have you, when they
yeah.
shouldn't. But yeah, I mean, mentality is a huge part of it.
So
I
I
think
mean,
I think
Go ahead.
anyone who can sit there and say, you know what, I have done some bad work
Yeah.
and I could improve is going to go far. The people who sit there and say, no, I'm perfect. Those people are a little more difficult to deal with, and it's a little more, um, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but you butt heads a little more with those people.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess other than a humble attitude, what else do you have in your QA toolbox that you work with on a daily basis? I know we've mentioned Selenium briefly in this conversation. Maybe you could explain to the audience perhaps, what Selenium is. I think it's a new concept for a lot of people, especially more casual listeners.
Yeah, I mean, so Selenium's been around for a really long time. It's like I said, it's a very robust, code-heavy tool used to automate basically anything that you want it to. It's generally used on desktop applications or web applications, and
Okay.
really, it's limited only by your coding knowledge. You can tell it to do whatever you want, click on a thing, verify that the right thing loads, find this div, find this element, whatever you want,
Okay.
Selenium can do.
So would you say it's like an automation, or it's like a robot that you can program, hey, take 5 steps forward, turn right, take 3 steps, and then
Right.
try this, and then
Yep.
keep trying that over and over. Maybe on the fifth pass, take 2 steps instead of three, and then report to me all these results.
Yeah, and you can tell it to, the way it reports results is you tell it what to expect,
Okay.
and then it will come back with you with, hey, this is what we expected, here's what happened. Like if you tell it to expect element X to load on a page when you go to a URL, and then you
Right.
go to the URL and it doesn't load, it's going to return a report that says we expected element X to load, we waited this long, element X didn't load, and that will be considered a fail, right?
Okay. So let's say we're an 8-year-old who's found his dad's lighter for the first time, right? So the Selenium script would be like, hey, try to light the paper on fire, and then if it doesn't catch fire, then report an error, or
Yeah, I mean, at a high level,
how would you?
yes,
Yeah, if you could just
but
walk maybe me through a simple script you would write in such a circumstance, that'd be fascinating.
well, the first thing you want to do before you write any scripts, the first thing you need to do is understand what it is that you're trying to test.
Okay.
Because if we take your example strictly as it is and say light a piece of paper, make sure it catches on fire.
Yeah.
If we say take lighter, light paper, ensure paper is on fire, the program's not going to know what to do with the lighter to make sure it lights the paper on fire. It's going to try to use the
Oh,
lighter to light the paper on fire without knowing how the lighter works.
right.
It's going to cause a bunch of errors. There's this is a really long conversation about like kind of QA methodologies, but um, there's a lot to take into account when you're making an automation suite, and
Right.
it's because what like I said, it boils down to how much you know how to code for using Selenium, right?
Right.
And that's
Right. Which
that's
is
just for
very
using
different from
Selenium,
traditional coding, right? Because
right?
because you're not. I would say that just from what you're describing in my experience, Selenium coding, it's not really coding in the traditional sense that you're building to solve a problem. You're more laying out a bunch of steps in
Yeah.
explicit detail as you can on how to do
Yes.
something over and over and over, and perhaps
Right.
more importantly, what to expect after every single
Yes.
scenario. Okay.
Yes. And that's basically the QA side of it. The actual coding side limited by only what you know about coding for Selenium. The QA aspect of testing, let's say that lighter, you have to know every single step in minute detail so
Right.
that you can tell it exactly what to do and what the expected results are. Because if you have one step that's vague or one step that just doesn't make sense, or you skip a step that needs to be there,
Okay.
it will fail more often than it'll succeed. So there's a lot that goes into making an automation suite, and there's tools out there. I mean, Selenium's not just the only automation tool. There's so many. There's Test Rigger,
Right.
Catalog, Mabel, Excel Q. They're all over the place. And many of them are even introducing AI into it now, which makes it a lot easier. So even if you don't know how to code, you can just go in and say, hey, I want to do this, and the AI will just spit out a block of code for you. It could work in theory. I've seen it work, but
Right.
for me, I believe you should still know some coding so that you can verify it yourself to say, okay, I see what it's doing. That's correct. Let's implement it.
Okay, so I mean, since you've mentioned the elephant in the room, I mean, AI. How is AI changing things? I mean, does it necessarily lower the threshold of knowledge required to be an excellent QA engineer? Like, can you just kind of like ask AI to, hey, write me a script to do the testing for it? Or
I think AI is a wonderful tool to have for any QA. I don't really foresee it replacing QA,
okay,
at least not for the foreseeable future. The issue becomes with AI. You have people using AI to try to write QA steps, QA scripts, whatever
right,
it needs to be,
yeah, right,
effectively try to replace QA with AI. The
yeah,
problem is AI is not a QA. AI can QA, but it is not a QA, right?
okay,
Someone like myself who's been doing QA for 10 years, like I said, with the lighter, knowing each individual step and knowing what to check for and what to verify for is a
right,
skill I learned because I manually tested a bunch of stuff for years.
right,
AI is not going to know how to kind of break everything down into those really minute steps. It's going to likely take the fastest path to get there, which isn't
right.
always what you want to do.
So, I mean, one analogy I heard a long time ago about the difference between machine learning and natural learning is that, for if you're throwing a ball to a kid, right? I mean, a kid will learn to catch the ball naturally through like, muscle memory. He'll
Mhm.
he'll learn that skill and it'll become ingrained in him through practice.
Mhm.
Whereas AI, for example, that would look, hey, it's trying to calculate the velocity of the ball coming towards it, trying to calculate the wind, everything else like that, and it just breaks it down into like mathematical calculations. There's no actual finesse to it. It can't describe what it's actually doing because it's just kind of breaking it down into fundamental calculations, right? It
Yeah,
it doesn't have that kind of reasoning behind it to describe the process. So to take it back to a
doesn't have the
writer,
human aspect.
it's not just the human aspect. I mean, like you said, if AI was presented with a liner and a piece of paper, I mean, it knows that from reading tons of books and newspaper reports about, pyromaniac children. It knows that like lighters are a danger, and it knows that paper is flammable, but it can't necessarily draw a correlation that yes, I need to still light this piece of paper on fire 500 times to prove the lighter works, right?
Yeah, there's a lot that goes into being a QA that AI can't know yet. With the nature of machine learning, the more that it learns, the more human, the more real it becomes.
Yeah.
So at some point, maybe yes, AI can take over the job entirely, but we're definitely not there yet.
So the thing is, if there's so much about AI that you've learned that how are you able to share these strategies? How are you able to share this knowledge with others? Is there going to be like ever a QA boot camp or anything like that, or
Well, so there's plenty of like we were saying earlier, there's plenty of like certifications that you get online, like ISTQB or
right,
Coursera, Udemy, even Codecademy has a few. There's plenty of certifications and courses that you can do, but it really what I want to communicate to people is all these courses, all these tools shouldn't be the end all be all of QA. For anyone that's looking to go into a QA career, this isn't the end
right,
all be all of QA. QA is an ever evolving field that needs fluidity, it needs flexibility, it needs you to be able to think on the fly and break things down into individual steps. A certification, someone could be the highest level ISTQB certified, but unless they've worked a bunch of QA jobs, I'm not
yeah.
going to really trust them, you know, truly to fully handle my QA process unattended until I see it work for the first time. Because unless you, like I said, unless you work the job, you really don't know what to expect.
Right, right. So, what would you say then to all the QA cubs out there who are just trying to get started and, enter that entry level QA? I mean, are there still opportunities for that? I mean, one thing
Oh yeah.
myself in the development world I see is like there's no entry level developer opportunities anymore. So,
It's very difficult to find. What I'm seeing more often than not now is that they aren't listed as entry level QA,
okay.
right? It's just listed as QA tester or QA whatever, or
Hmm.
whatever the title is. There's so many different titles for QA now.
Right,
It's ridiculous. But I mean, my recommendation is what I did was start in video games.
right.
It's very easy to start in video games, especially if you live in a big city. They're
Okay.
always hiring for QA, right?
Okay.
They are crap hours. They are likely not going to have much creative freedom, I'll
Yeah.
say. It's very micromanagey. They tell you exactly what to test,
Hmm.
and that's kind of, your days are very, very structured.
Right.
Granted, it's been, some years since I've worked in video games, but from what I've heard, it's not changed much. But it's a foot in the door. And if you go into it expecting that you're going to move out of it to, transition QA into another field, then by all means, that's a good place to start. Otherwise, all it is finding a way to market your skills, market your past experience
Right.
in a way that makes sense from a QA standpoint, which, in my opinion, every position that anyone has ever worked has had some level of quality assurance to it.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of communicating it. And if you can communicate it, then you can get what is an entry level role. And once you get the first one, that's always the hardest one to get. And then it's open skies from there.
Right.
I have, a couple business ventures that I'm pursuing right now. One being a QA staffing company myself, and the other one being a service that helps people find their career basically. Because like I said, and you said you found a job through Craigslist too.
Yeah.
My whole goal is to help people do that,
Mhm.
right? I got very lucky with the Craigslist ad, of course, but I think anyone can do it. And I think it's just a matter of putting your mind to it and really, really just digging your heels in, so to
Yeah.
speak.
I mean, after all, how many years did you have to pay your dues doing video game testing?
How many years was it? I believe it was 4 years.
Oh wow, that is
Yeah,
that is a long time to
three
keep at it.
3 to 4 years of video game QA.
Yeah.
And
Any names other than Square Enix we would know out of there?
Square Enix, Treyarch, Nexon,
Okay.
Nexon America, they do Maple Story,
Oh,
and
Maple
yep,
Story. Yeah, you did that. Jeez.
and Riot Games as well. Yeah, Maple Story was huge. Uh,
Okay.
that was a tough one. I'd say the toughest out of
Yeah,
all
I
of them was
mean,
Treyarch, but Nexon is close second.
yeah, and like you said, a lot of those gaming companies, it's not fun. They just grab kids and they'll just grind them up and spit them out. And I think, just owing to what you were saying, like unless people are willing to market themselves, unless you have some degree of self sales, which is really what, interviewing
It's
up
hard.
in this
It's
world
hard.
is. Yeah, like, and I've heard so many excuses myself, like, oh, I can't do that. I'm an introvert or whatever. It's like, okay, then you don't eat. Sorry. It's a tough world, but not so tough that you can't start some other ventures. You did mention your own Forge QA. Maybe you like to take a
Yeah.
few minutes go into that.
Yeah. So I mean, Forge QA I started because, like I was saying, I was a bit tired of QA being kind of the last thought,
Hmm.
right? It's the, just passed off to QA, they'll rubber stamp it. So I
Right,
wanted to
right,
create a company that staffed QA, that looked at things from my point of view and had the skills, the training, the confidence necessary to communicate QA's effectiveness and being included earlier in the process.
right.
So I started Forge QA a few months ago, to kind of get that QA community started. And really just tried to nail down the best way of bringing these types of QA into the field and into the fold.
All right.
And off the back of that, I even started, it's a separate one. It's called Six Figured Out. It's kind of a subsidiary. I don't even know if that's the real legal technical term, but
I mean, clearly we're both lawyers here, right? So,
right. Yeah. But it's Six Figured Out. The website's going up in a week or two, but it's a whole resume service, career coach type of business venture where, like I said, I help people figure out what it is they want to do, because at the end of the day, like, I know QA, right? Obviously, I know QA and I can help people with QA, but like you were saying, the self-sales skills necessary in order to find a career and excel in it, I feel like is dying out.
Yeah, for sure.
And a lot of people need help just getting their foot in the door for whatever it is that they're trying to do. So again, that's why I started the Six Figured Out. Was, I worked my way from, retail management. I didn't even have a job for a while at a point there. Unemployed, making nothing, to making, over six figures. And I honestly, truly believe anyone else can do it. They just need a little bit of help at the start. Just get them past the starting line. And that's the whole goal. That's the whole point, is just help people get past that starting line, and they'll take off.
So I guess before, just to close things out here, so keeping in line with your holistic vision for QA, you really have to get in there deep and understand the company's workings beyond just like, hey, this is a feature we want to get running. You have to understand everything. You have to understand the entire product. When pitching Forge QA, do you ever run into any resistance that, like, look, we're an external entity, but we want to learn everything about your company such that we could do your job better? Has that been a source of any resistance?
I'll say no, but it's because I approach it differently. Rather than saying that, we need to know everything about your business or whatever it is, I communicate to them, hey, when it comes to QA, don't you get tired of, them finding a bug in a code, kicking it back, and then that process repeats for a week, and now your deadline's pushed back.
Right.
And 9 times out of 10, they'll say, yeah, I mean, that sucks. It's like, well, what if I told you could fix that? You just include QA earlier in the process. If you have a QA person that knows what they're talking about,
right? Which,
and then, I'll communicate that I have plenty of QA on hand that can do that, or I have experience doing that myself. You just explain to them, when you include QA early in the process, maybe this thing that they found on the first path, or the first pass through of whatever the code was, could have been addressed in the discovery call. It would have never been something that needed to be broken. And maybe, just maybe, that could have prevented all the other bugs too, because all those other bugs could have been a result of the new code that was added to fix the original issue. Right. So it's just communicating that there's so much value in including them early. You don't lose anything. Because a lot of people also are like, when there's no code to test, what's QA doing? What's their purpose? This is their purpose, to be part of these calls.
So yeah, now I'm actually seeing the sales soft skills you mentioned reflected back, because it looks essentially like, instead of kind of being in that mindset where you have to ask for permission to see this, ask for permission to see that, you're instead coming at it from a different angle. You're just like persuading someone that, hey, look, just give us access to everything. We'll catch things before they start, and if you want that, hey, that's your option, right? So
people get really impressed when you can answer the why before they even ask it.
That's definitely something that I will be taking away from our conversation today, sir. And I hope everybody listening is perhaps taking that away as well. So,
perfect.
Right. It's always great talking to you, Davrick.
Of course.
As usual.
Of course.
You're welcome back anytime, and hey, I'd love to catch up with you and the goings on of Forge QA anytime.
Of course. And I'd be happy to catch up with you as well. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right. I appreciate it, Davrick.
We'd be happy to give your Salesforce org a second look. Thank you for subscribing. We look forward to seeing you on our next episode.